De la interpretación paralela la pueden ustedes escuchar en la aplicación MixLR y el podcast es Sin Guión ni Son. Bienvenidos y damos inicio.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. This is our last session of the day before the party. So today we are so pleased to have with us our second keynote speaker, Dr. Sallie Hughes. She's going to be with us today to talk about journalism and democracy. Where do we go from here? Democratization of Mexico, and co-author of Making a Life in Multi-Ethnic Miami, Immigration and the Rise of a Global City, as well as numerous other academic publications. Most recently, she helped lead the Mexican team in the world of journalism study. She has presented her research at universities in the US, Latin America, and the UK. Her journalistic work prior to entering the academy appeared in the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, El Financiero, Mexico, Maclean's of Canada, among other outlets. She teaches courses in international communication and ethnic media and oversees the University of Miami Institute for Advanced Studies of the Americas, initiatives for faculty and doctoral students. We are so pleased to have you with us today and this evening to hear your special keynote. Thank you, Sallie.
Hola, buenas tardes. I want to thank Amy for that very generous introduction, and also Amy and Armando and all of you for this invitation. I've been watching Binacom now for some years, many years actually, and I've always admired the ethos of reciprocity, of shared knowledge. So that makes me even more honored to be here today. So this is a really broad topic. It's one that I've been thinking about on and off for several decades now. But of late, I've been experiencing it and thinking about it from a very different vantage point than when I started studying media and politics, particularly of Mexico in the 1990s. So I now teach journalism and consume all sorts of digital news and information in a country marked by the highest levels of mobilization and polarization in my lived memory. The current environment presents important, if not unprecedented, challenges to journalism and also to the quality of representative democracy of government. Given this, your kind invitation has offered me the opportunity to try to systematize my thinking about the challenges facing journalism, as well as some of the responses that seem to be emerging to these challenges. So what I'd like to do is look a bit at the US, put those in comparative perspective with Mexico, and embed what is happening in both countries in some broad global trends. I'll do this asking us all to keep in mind that some of what is happening involves local manifestations of global processes, while other things are much more closely linked to place-bound histories and to place-bound institutions. So what I'm going to present today is a bit of a reflection. It draws from more systematic evidence and argumentation in academic literature, but also draws from personal experiences and my initial readings of unfolding events. I need to acknowledge up front that I address this subject from a particular political and ideological position. With all of the imperfections in the actual practice of journalism and the actual experience and practice of democracy, my underlying assumption is that the performance of journalism matters for democracy. and that democracy, when it's conceived of as a system of government that protects human rights and resolves disputes peacefully with justice, is a possibility and a worthy one. So, as citizens, journalists, journalism studies professors, we live in interesting times. And we live in gut-wrenching times. Students disappeared or assassinated in Guadalajara. 17 students and 2 of their professors massacred in their classrooms weeks ago near my hometown. It's just one horrible parallel example. We also may live in a critical period in terms of how we govern ourselves and whether we can live peacefully together with greater dignity and greater fairness, or in other words, whether the arc of our lived history will or will not bend toward justice. So in the first part of the talk, I'll present some evidence that at the global scale, this is a period of what the popular press and some academic discussions are calling democratic backsliding, which is the weakening or disassembling of the set of democratic institutions in a particular country. Then I'm going to move on to review what I identify as 3 important contemporary challenges to the type of journalism that supports representative government with accountability and respect for human rights. And I'll also begin to outline responses to those challenges. So last January, a big headline on the website of The Economist said, in quotes, "Democracy continues its disturbing retreat." This was their presentation of their annual Democracy Index, which is one of several studies that annually measures the quality of governance globally. Democracy is captured qualitatively in terms of performance on several indicators, and quantitatively in terms of the number of political systems in the world. Indicators for the Democracy Index include the quality of electoral processes and the pluralism of those processes, the functioning of government, including accountability and representation, levels of political participation, the vibrancy of democratic political culture, and support for and protection of civil liberties. For the Economist, only about 5% of the world's population live in countries with very high levels of performance on these criteria. As of 2016, neither those of us in the United States or those of you in Mexico live in what The Economist qualifies as a highly functioning democratic political system. The annual measures of other studies, such as the more academic Polity 4 or the policy-oriented Freedom House, show similar trends across time. None of the studies are perfect, but together they document a global context that challenges what was until recently a dominant narrative that emphasized a significant expansion of liberal democracy throughout the globe at the end of the 20th century. Looking at the Polity 4 measures across time, the decline of authoritarian political systems in the last decades of the 20th century is clear. This reflects transitions from authoritarian rule in Eastern Europe, as well as from military dictatorships in South America. The replacement of communist regimes and military dictatorships with systems that produce high levels of performance on these criteria of pluralism, of appreciation of civil rights, is not clear, however. Instead of the decline of authoritarianism and the replacement with high-functioning democracies, what we see is mostly a wave of democracies and democratic authoritarian hybrids with middle levels of performance. We shouldn't underestimate the advance in protections for human rights or representation that many of these systems represent compared to often brutal dictatorships. But most of the new or renewed democracies of the period fell short of establishing robust government accountability, respect for rights, and press freedom. are even these advances in retreat? In terms of numbers, the expansion of political systems with those highest levels of performance, that would be the yellow line, has stalled. The trend line shows there was no growth in the category between 2006 and 2015, and there is that slight dip downwards in 2016. Now, in the Journal of Democracy, the debate in just the last few years has centered on the level and seriousness of challenges to democratic performance. Roberto Fau and Yasha Monk examined 4 world values survey measures that are indicators of the legitimacy of political regimes rather than the legitimacy of a particular governor. The indicators they review are whether citizens express support for the system as a whole, the degree to which they support key institutions of liberal democracy, such as civil rights, their willingness to advance political causes within the existing political system, and their openness to authoritarian alternatives such as military rule. They describe their findings as deeply concerning. Citizens in a number of supposedly consolidated democracies in North America and Western Europe have not only grown more cynical of about their political leaders, rather they have also become more cynical about the value of democracy as a political system, less hopeful that anything they might do would influence public policy, and more willing to express support for authoritarian alternatives. The crisis in democratic legitimacy extends across a much wider set of indicators than previously appreciated. So, we'll see if this works. All right. So this table compares, if I could read it without my glasses, I would. It compares age groups. It compares support for democracy versus authoritarian alternatives across 2 time periods. In the US and the European Union, we see that democracy has lost credibility with all age groups in the US and with the youngest age groups in Europe. The authors go on to note that support for democracy as a regime is slipping support for democracy as a regime is especially notable among the wealthy. In 1995, the richest 20% of the population were the most opposed to undemocratic views, such as the suggestion that their country would be better off if the army ruled. Since then, relative support has reversed. In almost every country, the rich are now more likely than the poor to express approval for having army rule. In the United States, among all age cohorts, the share of citizens who believe that it would be better to have a, quote, strong leader who does not have to, quote, bother with parliament and elections has also risen over time to 32%. The authors note the proportion of citizens who approve of, quote, having experts, not governments, make decisions according to what they think is best for the country has grown from 36 to 49%. And again, they note that one of the reasons for these changes is that more affluent citizens have come to support them in greater percentages. So these trends start well before the election of Donald Trump, and they may suggest a governing strategy to him, although it's unlikely he reads the Journal of Democracy. There may be a chance that his political advisors do. Political scientist Nancy Bermeo, in a recent essay, offered insights into how democratic reversal might happen by looking at the history of such reversals across the second half of World War II. The most interesting finding is that, as she describes it, the mechanisms of reversal have changed over time. The failed democracies since 1990 have not featured coups and outright voter fraud. In most cases, these obvious forms of democratic reversal have been replaced by varieties of backsliding that are ironically legitimated through the discourses and institutions that democracy promoters prioritized. So these mechanisms include long-term harassment of the opposition, civil society, and the independent press, along with voter manipulation prior to elections. What she calls executive aggrandizement, basically reaching beyond the usual powers by the executive, that undermines controls of executive authority with the consent, often, of voter majorities. And also what she calls promissory coups, which are ostensibly undertaken to perform or defend democracy. So the opposition's poor performance in these scenarios on economic and political dimensions, including often highly publicized cases of corruption, increase support for the erosion of opposition through harassment, promissory coups, and executive expansion. Looking at the US, is it working? I think you skipped. Go back. Can you go back? Give it a second. Okay, there we go. Looking at the U.S., Mickey Levitsky and Way, in their essay, analyzed why they believe the United States is in danger of backsliding, calling on examples globally and an analysis of U.S. racial politics since the 1970s. A possible endgame that they see is what Levitsky has called in other places competitive authoritarianism, or a system in which meaningful democratic institutions exist, yet the government abuses state power to disadvantage its opponents. They identify polarization and radicalization on the U.S. right as undermining the structural and cultural foundations of U.S. democracy, opening up an opportunity for executive expansion. I would add these tendencies are possible on the left as well if they have not been as advanced or visible. The broader argument is that extreme overlapping forms of polarization weaken restraints on presidential authority by creating a Manichaean or a black and white zero-sum game environment where compromise is punished by mobilized voters with the strongest beliefs, and the opposition is demonized, aka lock her up, aka un peligro para Mexico, etc. When the opposition becomes a danger to the nation and should be locked in jail without impartial investigation or trial, it becomes legitimate to use undemocratic tactics to secure electoral victories, including voter suppression, gerrymandering, and possibly stacking the leadership of investigative bodies in the courts with loyalists. Legislative gridlock under the scenario from polarization and the lack of compromise erodes government effectiveness, which in turn pressures support for institutions that check executive power. Support for executive decision-making that gets things done becomes the preferred alternative. So beyond capitalizing on and promoting polarization, another way Levitsky and his team believes elected authoritarians tilt the playing field is by neutralizing key parts of civil society. They describe the possible scenario based on cases elsewhere as the following. Few contemporary autocracies seek to eliminate opposition outright. Rather, they attempt to co-opt, silence, or hobble groups that can mobilize it. Media outlets, business leaders, labor unions, religious associations, and so on. The easiest route is co-optation. Thus, most authoritarian governments offer perks or outright bribes to major media, business, and religious figures. Friendly press outlets get privileged access. Favored business leaders receive profitable resource concessions and government contracts. To handle those who resist, autocrats turn to the politicized authorities. Newspapers, television networks, websites that denounce government wrongdoing face libel or defamation suits, or are prosecuted for publishing material that supposedly promotes violence or threatens national security. Business leaders critical of the government are investigated for tax fraud or other infractions, and opposition politicians get mired in scandals dug up or simply invented by intelligence agencies. Sustained harassment of this type can seriously weaken the opposition. So Mickey and his colleagues believe the opposition to democratic backsliding could come from the courts, which take much longer to capture for political purposes. The investigative press, they argue, is too weak. Few listen to this press, and when they do, they accept or reject their messages based on partisanship. However, contradicting their dismissal of what I call accountability journalism, they argue that the, quote, greatest break, unquote, on backsliding will likely be presidential unpopularity, which in the case of the US could embolden Republicans to back away from their unconditional support for the president. While the courts and co-partisan defection as sources of resistance to presidential aggrandizement seem reasonable, the argument about the role of journalism, I think, needs greater unpacking. How does information that makes a president unpopular reach public opinion in order to move it enough to prompt Republican defection? How does an executive who wishes to expand his powers become unpopular, at least to all but his most committed base supporters? So barring a major terrorist event or a Katrina-like disaster, which are real possibilities, and in fact, the latter has happened and continues to happen in Puerto Rico. Strategic leaking to reporters and muckraking journalists allows negative information about the presidency, be it Trump or Peña Nieto, to enter the public sphere. In the case of Trump, some of this information is harder to frame in ways that protect the president with more than his narrowest base. So I'm talking about misogynistic behavior and statements and potentially criminally liable real estate deals. So plenty of work in the US and Mexico demonstrate exposés of presidential misconduct are differentially framed, differentially emphasized or not, and differentially echoed or not throughout the media sphere. And they are differentially attended to and interpreted to by media consumers. But factually based exposés are still one of the main conduits, if not the main conduit, of critical factual information about the president and his party. And in some instances, they can crystallize public opinion in ways that successfully activate chains of accountability. The Washington Post carefully documented revelations of sexual abuse of teenagers and young women by Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore in Alabama come to mind. The facts were too negative, the credibility of the sources too strong, and the verification of the facts, in this case by the Washington Post, was too complete to be ignored. The revelations, coupled with National Democratic Party investment and grassroots mobilization, which activated opposition voters and either shifted support or demoralized weakly leaning Republicans, who then shifted parties or sat out of the election. Now, Mickey and his colleagues might consider the Moore defeat somewhat dismissively as simply a contingent event, where an indefensible set of facts crystallized as a yes-no decision in a particular election. However, the process of activating what O'Donnell calls vertical accountability through elections occurred because multiple democratic institutions were involved, and that's democracy with a little d, that facilitated the first electoral defeat of a Republican Senate candidate in Alabama since the post-civil rights partisan alignment in the US South. You might not know that reference, but it's a big deal. These institutions that were involved in this instance of vertical accountability were a free and investigative press, the local and national Democratic parties, and civil society issue groups and partisan organizations at the grassroots and national level. So in my view, the Moore defeat is illustrative of how investigative journalism, through factually verified publicity of moral and political misconduct, can still activate accountability chains, or, as Latin American media theorists Perazzotti and Schmolefitz have called it, chains of social accountability, where the press, civil society, reformists in government, and ultimately elections play a decisive role in holding politicians to account for their actions. So even as processes of democratic backsliding are in play, the institutions of democracy, including the press, still respond in some cases. So my purpose in the rest of the essay is not to identify the conditions under which press exposés may activate accountability chains in democracies where executive expansion may be going on. Rather, I want to gauge the challenges to and capacities of accountability journalism to actually continue. And what I mean by accountability journalism is the production and publicity of factually based information relevant to the quality of democracy and verified by journalists exercising professional autonomy, whether at the individual or organizational levels. So professionalism in this view is defined as adhering to standards of practice and of ethics that promote social responsibility to identify and serve some level of shared good, shared public good. The degree to which the information is published with the intention to spark accountability actions is really less important than its verification and revelation by actors within professional news organizations. So I'm going to use the rest of my time to review what I think these three interrelated challenges are, as well as some responses from within journalism and civil society that are appearing. The challenges are the epistemological challenge of post-truth, the harassment of critical journalists, and the political economic challenge. So I will compare the US and Mexico on each of these dimensions. So first, the epistemological challenge. Give it time. Maybe give it a little more time. The epistemological challenge of polarization in a post-truth era. Not working, and it's my favorite photo too. It'll get there, I hope. No? No? Maybe escape? No, todavía. Arriba. Bueno. Eso arriba. Arriba más. Más. Eso. Yeah. Okay. So, the epistemological challenge of polarization in a post-truth era. So, social and political polarization in both our countries, of course, has very long roots, even going back to European contact. However, for us living in the US, the level of political mobilization and polarization visible over the last 2 years still at times comes as a shock, especially when a crystallizing event is delivered as an unexpected news alert on your smartphone. One more. So these are sort of the shocking images that we've seen in the last 3 years in the United States. For those who are too young to remember the civil rights movements and war protests of the 1960s, or for most of you who weren't around yet, mobilization levels seem unprecedented. We see and participate in the largest political rallies since the Vietnam War, and our friends, both real and cyber, organize in political groups that are taking actions, some of which are symbolic, and others of which apply direct pressure on elected representatives. The indivisible guide for grassroots organizing that came from former congressional staffers is the progressive update of the tactics of the right-wing Tea Party that stymied many of President Obama's reforms. However, while most of the protesters in the streets, airports, and schools oppose the policies of our current president and majority in Congress, the underlying differences in American society are deeper than partisan politics. The crystallizing events, policy proposals, and messages sometimes touch profound aspects of identity and moral belief systems, and in doing so, activate cognitive scripts and emotional filters, blocking counter-arguments or contradictory facts. Sometimes division is deepened by messages carefully constructed for our psychographic profiles, the raw material of which we willingly have served up over the 14-year life of Facebook. The spaces and processes facilitating meaningful dialogue across ideological, class, and racial divides seem harder to access, and not only because of news bubbles and Facebook algorithms. Residential segregation in the U.S. has shifted since the 1960s. Many of us live in proximate but separate racial and income communities, according to Harvard government professor Reina Enos. This close but distant form of segregation without integration explains a great deal of the fear that makes the politics of division electorally profitable, she argues. At the same time, neoliberalism as an economic philosophy and more has manifested in budget cuts and delegitimization of the commons and the public good, reducing shared physical spaces and weakening public schools, even if these schools continue to produce brilliance. And I would say that while thinking of the Parkland high school students who have taken on the most powerful lobby in the United States. They all came from public schools, even though they quickly acknowledge it's a privileged public school. So in this context, voices that claim to represent one immutable truth on the matters that divide us find it easier to rally like-minded audiences by appealing to cherry-picked facts or outright fabrications that confirm pre-held biases. This confirming evidence must not only travel through media and geographic bubbles to reach a receiver, but somehow bypass unexamined cognitive scripts and emotional filters. The scenario of polarization, mobilization, and immutable truth that defies contestation creates a major challenge to journalism and is conceived of as an approximation of factually based reality. In such a scenario, the credibility of empirically verified knowledge of facts, whether presented as science or as journalism, becomes severely strained. The belief that journalism can approximate truth by reporting facts within their full context on behalf of the shared interests of society falls to the wayside in favor of litmus tests and missing anything that contradicts with previously held views or ideological, partisan, or emotional commitments. Non-conforming information is fake news. The selective framing of facts matters a lot, and we see the same set of facts framed in different ways. News agendas matter too, but the facts themselves don't matter so much. And one more. But this is only how the reception side of the communication process challenges fact-based journalism. The information environment offers varied and numerous challenges to the legitimacy of a journalism that tries to contextualize facts in a way that serves a broader interest. As Claire Waddle of First Draft News argued last week, the information environment is saturated with different types of misinformation, meaning the inadvertent sharing of false information, and disinformation, meaning the deliberate creation and sharing of information known to be false. Types of false information, or fake news, are varied. They include what is created by quote-unquote poor journalism, where headlines and contextual information don't fit the facts, and or where news is purposefully manipulated to serve an outside agenda. False information also includes information that appears to be professionally produced, so that is dressed in the trappings of journalistic legitimacy, but which is actually deliberately manipulated or fabricated for propaganda or for mischief. Poor journalism and deliberate outside manipulation delegitimize the journalism of verification and weaken the ability of journalism to act as an agent of accountability. In Mexico, the importance of political polarization and post-truth news reception patterns for the delegitimization of journalism is harder for me to gauge. Reformers' coverage of López Obrador is read with skepticism and selectivity by my friends on Facebook, who, by the way, seem to all support López Obrador, and who voice their opinions on a bias in some of Reformist coverage, the coverage they disagree with. Their comments echo focus groups of voters that Manuel Guerrero and I ran throughout the 2006 campaign season. In those groups, lower and higher income voters read or interpreted López Obrador and news coverage through emotional lenses. For higher income voters, what emerged was distrust in television news as the reference for all news, and fear of López Obrador, the candidate. This then mobilized their vote. On the other hand, distrust of television news and hope for López Obrador, the candidate, mobilized the lower income participants. So while there is evidence of polarization and post-truth filters, there is also distrust in the media based on memory and common knowledge about the economically and politically captured news environment. But the poor of journalism that Warrell identifies as part of the fake news ecosystem in the United States also seems to be in play. High-profile media scandals, such as the Frida Sofia story, the restaging of Florence Cassez's arrest years ago, the exposés of some media outlets' tight clientelistic ties to indicted state governors suggest multifaceted origins of distrust in news. And I have to add that the U.S. news also has a credibility problem based on poor performance beyond ideological dismissal of an outlet. Just two examples that come quickly to mind are the New York Times swallowing of the Bush administration's line that we were invading Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. And of late, and this was actually a positive thing in my view, National Geographic apologizing for decades of horrific racial racism on its pages. So it's unclear to me whether clear and high-profile ethical lapses are more salient in the Mexican or the U.S. case, but they both are part of the problem. The distrust in journalism brings consequences, whatever the salience of ethical lapses in poor journalism. Most important, perhaps, is that in the estimation of participants in last year's #Agenda de Periodistas meeting in Mexico City, following the assassinations of Javier Valdez and Miroslava Brecht, distrust, in their opinion, of the news depresses public outrage at the assassination and disappearance of journalists. Ethical scandals, partisan reading of news content, and government discourse all feed a narrative that some of the journalists, at least, are targeted because they themselves are enmeshed in corruption. The epistemological challenge of post-truth may not be of the magnitude of previous disjunctures for journalism, as perhaps was 19th century U.S. progressivism was to yellow journalism and partisan news, or in Mexico, perhaps the systemic shocks of 1968 and 1994 that tarnished the pro-PRI journalism of the Mexican miracle. But the challenge to accountability journalism does seem very important. Now, responses to this from the news side, such as increased fact-checking and greater transparency in news production, I don't think will solve the epistemological challenge if distrust of the source is buttressed by emotional commitment, cognitive scripts, poor journalism, and a wider environment of the news that's toxic. What responses might there be? Beyond public-focused regulation or the preemptive actions of the Facebook and Twitter executive boards in the last few weeks, which may lead to opening up some of the bubbles and may lead to better financing for some local news. Two responses that may have a chance of supporting verified, contextualized, factually based journalism can be identified, although both come forward in a very optimistic scenario. The first is media literacy. I think our last speaker called it something else, but I think we're talking about the same thing. Including emotional literacy, where media users learn to recognize and question their own emotional responses to media messages. This requires reflection and dedication on the part of the user. It requires a desire to move beyond post-truth. I imagine it's closely connected to the reach and quality of public education. A second potentially serendipitous outcome of partisan news bubbles and selection bias is that the interest in outlets conducting carefully documented investigative journalism, such as the Roy Moore abuse cases or Javier Duarte's Empresas Fantasmas in Veracruz, have increased page views and subscriptions in these media. In the US, the Washington Post and the New York Times have been hiring after almost a decade of doldrums. Even National Public Radio's ratings, and I'm laughing because National Public Radio has a way of touching the highbrow, being proud of its low ratings. But even National Public Radio's ratings are at the highest they've ever been. In Mexico, Animal Politico's model of hard-hitting, fact-based expose has been rewarded also with an increase in hits and viewers. So to the degree that journalists retain their commitment to factually based reporting beyond the Trump and Pena years, the organizational basis for accountability journalism has been strengthened by partisan interests. More broadly, of course, having structural supports that lessen polarization, such as policies that reduce geographic and economic divisions, have to be part of a long-term solution. Okay, let's move to the second challenge. The second challenge, not yet, is the harassment of journalists. So closely related to this challenge of post-truth is the hostile media environment. The causes, contexts, and intensities of anti-press harassment in our countries have many differences. The ability and political will of judicial response to anti-press threat also differs. Yet in my view, anti-press harassment in both countries represents a serious challenge to accountability journalism. A political strategy of polarization seeks not only to delegitimize accountability journalists, but even further to other journalists as not one of us and therefore one of them. The occupant of the most powerful political office in the US frequently calls critical journalists, commentators, and outlets the enemies of the people. And in a context of polarization and post-truth beliefs, 1/3 of the US population say they believe him. As important, only 1/3 of those in his political party think he's wrong, that journalists are not enemies. So polarization, mischief makers, and likely the permission afforded by the president's us versus them discourse fuels an environment where US journalists are psychologically and sometimes physically threatened. Stay there. Covering extreme groups such as white supremacists, being a woman, and tech writing columns on the African American experience draw fountains of ire, insult, and threat to the journalists and the journalists' families. Offline, journalists can be literally encircled by police when they're covering protests in a maneuver called kettling, which encircles all the protesters and hems them in with no place to go. Freelancers, who are increasingly the ones covering major news events, can face lengthy periods of legal uncertainty, high legal costs, and job insecurity, particularly if their equipment is seized, notes the Committee to Protect Journalists, which has strengthened its unit covering threats to the U.S. press. Disinformation campaigns launched from who knows where not only work to undermine the credibility of particular media outlets, but expose journalists to threats. So in my hometown paper, the Miami Herald, there were 2 instances of this shortly following the massacre of high school students in nearby Parkland, Florida. The top one? The first slide is a screenshot of a tweet of an altered version of a Miami Herald story that claims another school has been credibly threatened on specific dates and warns parents to take precautions. This is false. The story was about something else. The second slide is the reporter's response to an incident where her tweets seeking personal stories about the Parkland victims were altered so it appeared she was asking about the race of the shooting suspect and requesting people send her pictures of the dead bodies of the murdered students. The motives for the disinformation seem not only to be to enhance polarization by stoking fear and racist sentiment, but also to undermine trust in these journalists and their news outlet, which, despite cuts, continues to be the strongest source of shared fact-based knowledge about local affairs in our area. And in doing so, and now I'm connecting this to the hostile media environment, these tweets expose journalists to threat and vitriol. So other forms of risk to U.S. journalists have to do with sexism and racism as systems of oppression. Journalists of color, women, and gender minorities seem to be especially exposed to online hate. Within newsrooms, the Me Too movement convinced, and this is a response, many women to come forward, or it forced upper managers to finally take actions against powerful high-level editors. The ideological spectrum of the newsrooms is not the issue. This happened in Fox News as well as National Public Radio. The level of threat to U.S. journalists and the ability to respond to the threats have to be kept in context. 2/3 of the U.S. population, wonderful, do not believe journalists are the enemies of the people. Much of the online hate is manufactured by bots and outsiders, not just infuriated readers. Journalists who work for financially strong and ethically responsible employers have access to best practice training about digital security, and indeed many press rights groups place these how-to guides online. More needs to be done in an area of self-care. What I mean by this is testimonials of threatened journalists suggest occupational stress and even PTSD symptomology. Targets of harassment report leaving the profession, masking their gender online, or self-censoring to avoid or lower the likelihood of abuse. We don't have systematic evidence about how rampant this problem is. We have many testimonials that suggest to us that threats cause real damage. It's unclear whether there will be impunity for these actions. I know the Miami Herald is working to identify those responsible for tweets and plans legal action. As yet, these actions are not complete. So when we compare this to Mexico, it's obvious that journalists in Mexico face a much, much more complicated situation. Yeah. We know the statistics of assassinations, disappearances, espionage, many other forms of physical, verbal, and psychological attacks. And thanks to systematic data collection by press rights groups such as Article 19, we also know a lot about the likely origins of these attacks from political, criminal, and overlapping factions. So my work with Mireya Marquez Ramirez, as well as the work of many of you and many journalism studies researchers who work in the same conditions of risk as the journalists, has documented self-censorship and other negative effects on accountability journalism, as well as on journalists' general well-being, personal well-being. 2/3 of Mexican journalists say they have self-censored in the last 5 years to reduce risk from criminal organizations and mobs. Survey evidence finds that direct threat is the biggest predictor of having self-censored, but pressures from economic actors, including advertisers, which could be private sector or government, is another strong predictor. Legal response to threats in Mexico is extremely poor, as we all know. Impunity is nearly complete. And from what I read in the press, the reform to make government advertising more transparent may end up being a simulation. I wish I had a better answer here. Pressure from civil society, which is organized, perhaps a groundbreaking election and a change of security strategy might help to change the situation. It's linked deeply to problems in public insecurity, political corruption, and journalists' desire to perform or not to perform the functions of accountability journalism. So I'm going to turn to the third challenge, the political economic challenge. Challenges to the epistemology underlying journalism is verified fact with a public interest ethos possible. And the attacks on news outlets and individual journalists come at a time when the organizational foundations of accountability journalism, especially on the local level, have been severely weakened. The financial freefall of legacy news companies in both countries is attributable to competition from digital news aggregators, but also the credibility gap caused by poor journalism, as Whittle called it, and other forms of fake news. And I think an inability of geographically bound news outlets to connect with an increasingly mobile, socially diverse, and politically active audiences. In Mexico, give it a minute. It holds us in suspense. Bueno. There you go. All right. Downsizing in Mexico and the U.S. has been more severe in media industries that produce and disseminate information, while employment in public relations and entertainment media are either level or have grown. This is a slide from the INEGI's annual employment surveys, and it shows full employment in each of these sectors of the media industry. It's compared to 2008, so anything above 100% has grown since 2008, anything below has declined. Declines in U.S. newspaper employment have also been severe, and the growth of digital news jobs hasn't kept pace. So Alex Williams, in the Columbia Journalism Review using Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're not going to get Alex, notes that job losses have been more severe in smaller cities and towns. News reporters in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles have actually grown, perhaps because of the larger digital outlets are located there. But as a result, citizens outside of these areas likely have fewer reporters acting as local watchdogs, and the media system, or I should say the accountability system, is becoming increasingly concentrated in coastal cities. There's also well-documented research on coverage of state legislatures by the Pew Research Center, which documents a 35% decrease in reporters between 2003 and 2014. In the current economic environment, in-depth reports are rare. Williams recounts, this seems exaggerated, but Williams recounts that a report by Mother Jones in which a senior reporter worked 4 months as a corrections officer and produced evidence of massive corruption in the private prisons industry, which is mushroom in our country, conservatively cost $300,000 to produce. It brought in $5,000 in banner advertisement. So finding a solution to the decimation of local news financing has become an important and visible political issue. It's doubtful the current political leadership will want to help too much, but the pressure may be why Facebook is now working with publishers in 15 media markets to find ways the platform can be used to boost local media subscriptions. And Google is offering fellowships to journalists to learn how to use its services to monetize their content. Google also recently announced a $300 million investment called the Google News Initiative, where it's working with a half dozen national news organizations to increase the use of an array of tools and background services to increase publishers' digital revenue. Also, locally talented young communications graduates, like many of you will be soon, and others keep opening media startups. Small-scale, locally, and global-focused media startups are trying to re-engage media audiences in socially meaningful ways. In our town, the New Tropic says it aims to attract the quote-unquote curious locals identified by the Brookings Institute who are populating our cities and want deeper connections to place and community. The local media ecology in my area is shifting as digital-based startups layer upon investigative functions and new nonprofits. And in our town, a report called the Watchdog Report is one. Public media has increased the number of reporters. And we still have a scaled down but active metropolitan newspaper. Actually, we have 3 in south of Florida altogether. Their financial sustainability is precarious, but they're trying to leverage connection to community and desire for news in ways that educators can support and nurture through innovative curriculum. You can go to this suspenseful slideshow. One more. So I presented mostly challenges today. Responses from within journalism are broadly, you can go forward, puedes adelantar si te deja. Okay, yeah. Responses from within journalism are calls for greater professionalism and transparency, experimentation with new business models, calls for new regulatory schemes, either by self-regulation of Google and Facebook, or maybe threats of government intervention. And also safety training, although in the US, not nearly enough, that should also support occupational and personal resiliency. But the quality of journalism is also deeply connected to the strength of civil society and the quality of the political system. Study after study has found a correlation between engaged citizens and the seeking of news. But mobilization needs to be coupled with critical thinking. That with journalism professionalism, new business models, and self-care could possibly be reinforcing. If we look at all of these components of a solution, or at least a way to remediate and extend the possibility of accountability journalism, we as educators, journalists, and citizens have a tremendous amount of work to do. So with that, I'll end, and thank you for paying attention to this. I guess we're going to have some questions. Yes.
Hi, I have 2 questions. One is how is it possible to have to be properly informed, to have a healthy diet of news when there's so many information out there? And my second question is, what can we do to reduce the level of opposition there's currently in politics, especially in American politics?
You mean polarization in American politics?
Polarization, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I should limit myself to journalism, but I would say that there's structural and long-term reasons for the polarization in American politics. They have to do with race, They have to do with growing economic inequality. What I mentioned about the segregation of the neighborhoods we live in, not all of us, but many of us, these are all structural factors that lend themselves to polarization, to fearing others, to not understanding others, to blaming others for economic downturns. But within that context, then, a communication strategy that relies on othering has the possibility of being effective. So those, to me, are the foundations of polarization in the U.S. and how we need to tackle them through long-term strategies. In terms of the proper diet, some of my friends are able to flip between our 3 news channels to get the right wing and the left and the sort of center left. The Wall Street Journal and others have apps and ways that you can see you can compare what's being run in the different sectors of our ideological media environment. I would just say read legacy news outlets, read several of them, read news from abroad, and compare. Engage in a little comparison and pay attention to sources. And hopefully all those things together will make you a better media consumer. That said, that takes a lot of time, right? So you have to figure out your shortcuts. I'm not sure that there's any one place to go to get what we need to understand the full environment.
I have another question for you. You were talking about the PR industry and the professionalization, the public relations industry and the professionalization of communication in political campaigns. And I was looking at this graph by Gallup from the mid-90s all the way to 2017. And it measures trust in mass media by party. And most parties distrust media during the election. It goes down, especially the Republican Party, of course, but it goes down considerably. The
trust in media broadly is one question.
Trust in media during the electoral periods. And my question, because I have seen that in Mexico as well. In the election, in 2000 election, when we started to celebrate competitive elections, there was this new profession that was created, the professional image maker or image manager of candidates. And people seem to hate that at some point, and people seem to disengage from the democratic process because it's so disingenuous. And you were talking about all those moral panics and those politicians become moral entrepreneurs and then bash on immigrants, and they bash on people of color, and then they bash on women. They make a lot of noise in order to gain attention during the election, right? They measure those things. They talk to their advisors, right?
Right.
I mean, in the case of Trump, he was an expert on tabloid media, right? He thrives on chaos, and that very thing, right? He's a moral entrepreneur, although he might be pretty moral himself. But you were talking about the distrust of people in democracy and how linked, my question is, how is that linked to that very professionalization of political process? Now journalists and people are advising candidates how to look better in the media, how to create a scandal, how to run elections. And people are looking at that and they're not liking it. The abstention level is going up really highly in Mexico too, and in the United States it was about 43% abstention level. People are not liking those kinds of campaigns. They seem disingenuous. So you think there is a relationship between that and distrust and democracy now, between campaigning and?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to disentangle the rise of public relations advisors for politicians. I mean, from other things like gridlock and belief that the political system just doesn't work for you. Also, you know, decline in political institutions and the media it's been happening in parallel fashion, right? So trust in institutions generally have been going down, you know, at least Dan would probably have the figures on hand, but at least since 1995 with the figures I showed. So it's kind of hard to disentangle, you know, the rise of professionalized public relations and elections and that. So I don't fully have an answer for you there, except to say that they're global phenomena and they go hand in hand with other explanations. I think the degree to which we see economic polarization, we see an economic downturn, and we see polarizing media messages, that's going to increase distrust in the political system. Hi.
I have 2 questions. I have 2 questions. One will be, you know, news in the U.S. The rhetoric is very different when it's in English and when it's reported in English and it's reported in Spanish. And it's not just the language. I mean, all the way they do or like they report the story is completely different. And you know, there is a lot of people who are planning to be a bilingual reporter. So how can they close that gap? And then what advice will you give to students to become like better or like to do their work diligently?
What are the differences that you see in English language and Spanish language news?
Well, I remember like there was some news like a few years ago that I saw, and it was about these. It happened in San Diego, mm-hmm. And they did some raids and they caught this guy. It was like in a bakery, and he brought like a lot of his family members were working there as well. So in the Spanish one, they were focusing on, you know, the immigration side and, you know, this poor guy who's going to be deported and all that. And then in the English side was more like, oh yeah, he's going to be accused of a smuggler. And they both said that. Mm-hmm. But the way they presented the news, it almost looked like it was 2 different stories.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of answers that people offer for that. One is it's because of political economy and who the audiences are. Right? So the Spanish language outlets will be serving a population that will be more receptive to the frame that they gave, and apparently the English language stations are the reverse. I don't necessarily believe that, but that's an argument. The other is that Spanish language outlets have a longer history in this country of advocacy for the community, and it goes back to the first newspapers and the first radio announcers, and I think, you know, to a certain degree that legacy is repeated in these newsrooms. I'm not sure whether bilingual reporting will necessarily do it, although these journalists do tend to act as sort of cultural translators in otherwise white newsrooms. So, I mean, there are studies of both Latino journalists and African American journalists in mainstream newsrooms, and they continually say they're silenced, they only show their worth by being whiter than white. They're not given that opportunity to really press agendas. But that's a very fatalist view, and all I can suggest is that you become adept at pressing agendas in ways that will be received. So what is the common news factors that you can identify, the news values that you can identify to press the sort of stories and the sort of frames that you think better reflect social justice, for example. So one is personal capacity to find those shared values. The other is, at least in Miami and probably in San Diego and LA and other places, the Hispanic audience is a market. It's a segment of the population that even English language news has to pay attention to. So that's another point of pressure. So I guess that would be my advice for you. Find the news values that are shared. Be as skilled as you can, knowing you'll have to be more skilled than others. Show how the community is part of the audience, and become the station director as soon as you can. That was a joke. Rise up and take control of the organization.
Hi, Sallie. Thank you very much for the conference. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm researching on Facebook. From my personal point of view, maybe I watch a lot of Black Mirror episodes. I recently quit Instagram and Twitter, and I'm trying to quit my Facebook account, and I'm not really happy using WhatsApp, but I haven't found an option.
Right.
I don't think many people use Telegram in Mexico. Well, but my question is regarding the future of Facebook. From the legal point of view, in Australia, in Europe, and in the US, Mark Zuckerberg is not having a good time. And from a social point of view, of people that are feeling watched, spied, what do you think is going to happen in the long term with Facebook, from a social perspective and a legal perspective?
So you're kind of taking me out of my comfort zone because I don't research that area. My guess is you know better. What I would say, though, is there are increasing calls for some sort of regulation. And what tends to happen when companies fear regulation is they make changes on their own. So maybe some of the things I mentioned, at least in terms of support for local news and lowering the bubbles and things like that, as an intermediary step might happen. In the US, though, the regulatory environment has to be changed, and that will only happen through elections and long-term pressure. I did see the Boston Globe published an opinion. I don't think it was their editorial, calling for the return of the fairness doctrine. Do you know the fairness doctrine? So the fairness doctrine was a form of regulation of over-air television until 1986 that required a couple of things. It required that television stations air a certain amount, television networks air a certain amount of public affairs programming as part of their offering, and required balanced coverage of issues, for example, offering response on issues of segregation in the South. So it was federal regulation, not of what to cover, but pushing toward opposing viewpoints and requiring that the networks included a significant part of their budget for public affairs programming. It produced the golden age of U.S. television documentary, for example, 60 Minutes in its heyday, and many other pieces. The fact that that's being called now for a return to that, something that we have in our textbooks but most people have never heard of, gives me a little bit of hope. But it's directly connected to what happens in the political system over the next couple of years. That's about as far as I can tease that out.
Hi. Well, you talk about the regulations, and I'm I want to know if you have a proposal for social media regulations. Yes, something, not the obvious, but something that you can show us, because in Mexico there are really nothing about social media regulation. We are like, I don't know, swimming with any rule, with any line. So maybe you have think about it, and you can give us a line.
So I think your colleague probably knows particularly the different regulatory schemes for social media around the world, and what seems to enhance, diversity and access to information without allowing hate speech and fake news to run rampant. I'm not personally aware of any system that really does that. I mean, in the U.S., there's it's very difficult to prosecute hate speech or any form of defamation. The laws are very much tilted toward allowing the so-called marketplace of ideas to regulate that sort of speech. But one thing that I thought was very interesting, and we'll watch closely, is that some of the parents of children who were murdered in Newtown, Connecticut in an elementary school by a gunman many years ago, not many years ago, I don't know, 8 years ago, are suing a right-wing media conspiracy propagator named Alex Jones, on defamation charges. They're suing for many millions because he repeatedly claimed that the massacre was made up, that the parent who held his child in his arms was an actor, that the child never existed, that the child never died. It'll be interesting to see if that case does produce a defamation verdict and many $1 million of damages. The parents were thrown into the public spotlight. They're not a public figure of their own volition. The standard in the U.S. is if you are a political official or a public, in the public eye, for reasons that may or may not have to do with your own volition, but we're talking about celebrities, people like that. The standards that you have to meet to prove defamation are very high. In this case, we'll see. We'll see if that case produces some case law about how far people can actually go with this sort of speech. In the U.S., I see the courts ruling on things like that. Until we have a political shift, I don't see regulation happening. But that's not an extremely informed opinion. Anything else? Yeah? Okay, we'll end it. Now we can go have our party.
Thank you so much, Sallie. So we would like to honor you with a special certificate for imparting the keynote conference, Journalism Democracy, Where Do We Go From Here? The 20th Biennial Encuentro of Binacom 2018, held at the School of Human Sciences of UABC on April 27th and 28th. And now we will have our host come tell us information about the fiesta.